Hi, my name's Steve Wells and I'm at Ninghan Pastoral Station where I'm completing my research on a project which is part of my Masters of Professional Archaeology at the University of Western Australia. Before I proceed, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Badamaya people, whose land I'm working on, and also the Pindidi Aboriginal Corporation. This morning I want to tell you a little bit about my project, the methodology I'm using, and also some of the findings. I'm about 400 kilometres to the north-northeast of Perth, and Ninghan Pastoral Station is the traditional home of Badamaya people, has been since the dreaming time, but from 1872 onwards, this part of the world has been used for pastoralism. The first person to establish a pastoralist here was a guy called Nathaniel Cook. He came here shortly after exploring the area in 1872, and from that time onwards this place has been used for pastoralism. And my research project is looking at the impact of pastoralism on the Badamaya people, particularly how the landscape has changed and how that changing landscape has influenced the lives of the people who have been in this part of the world since the 1870s. The country I'm on at the moment is fairly flat, open country, and it has a number of water supplies through springs and soaks, and this would have been a great spot for people to camp. This is well before pastoralism, so I get a picture that the landscape here was rich for the Badamaya people. Rich, but it was also fragile. They would stay for just enough time to utilise the water supply for drinking purposes, capturing a few animals for food, and then they'd move on to the next water supply. So as one of the owners of this property says, it's not a harsh country, it's a fragile country. The first explorers who came here and looked at this area in terms of pastoralism, they brought back mixed reports in the 1840s to the 1860s. There was pastoral country here, but it was in patches, and the water for them, being Europeans not knowing what the country was like, was pretty limited. That changed when people started to ask the Badamaya people how you went about finding water, and it soon became apparent there was sufficient water here to at least have a go to do pastoralism. So pastoralism was introduced, and with that a number of controls of the land came about through fencing, windmills, the idea of leasing land and saying who could come onto the country and who couldn't was introduced from the 1870s onwards. My project is looking at the land around the Ninghan Pastoral Station homestead. It was established in the 1870s, and as pastoralism took control of the land, the Badamaya people had changes to their traditional lifestyle, and they came onto the homestead site and they became workers, station workers for the pastoralists who've taken their land. And in my research I have identified 55 sites which are evidence of campsites around the homestead of Ninghan, and I have looked at what the artefacts that I've found in these deposits are telling me about the life of the people at Ninghan from the 1870s through to the 1920s, maybe even the 1940s. So where I am now, this is one of the 55 features that I've been doing my research on. We're here in October, the start of summer, and it's about 30 degrees and it's 8 o'clock in the morning. And what I'm amazed at, I've been to this site 4 or 5 times throughout the year. The place just changes. When I was first here in, when was it? It was in March 2015. This site was just barren. There was no vegetation whatsoever. And early September, this place was covered with wildflowers. And now we're at the end of the wildflower season, but we've still got grasses and pastures, which I guess the early settlers would have been pretty pleased to see because it meant that their sheep could graze. So what I'm finding here is it's a scatter or an assemblage, if you want to call it that, of artefacts that are telling me what was going on for the lives of the Badamaya people. In terms of the archaeology, I'm using what they call an surface assemblage methodology. That means I'm not going to dig up or take away any of the artefacts I find. I'm going to analyse them in situ or on site. I'm going to take lots of photos and use those to analyse any results later at my leisure back in my office. So it's a non-intrusive or non-invasive technique. What I want to show you now is some of the artefacts that I've found. You can tell by my hands waving that the flies have started. This is one of the joys of doing archaeology in a hot farming community, but nevertheless, here we go. That's just a small shard of a bit of plate, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's got Sol and Meakin and England. I can take the photo of that I would take when I'm doing my research, and I can actually date the time of manufacture of that plate, and I've done that. This range of tableware was manufactured around 1910, and it had a fairly short production run for about 10 years, so that gives me a rough indication. It obviously can't be here before then, but it is probably arriving at Ninghan, probably used by the pastoralists, then discarded, and then it's used by the Badamaya people while they are working here as shepherds or stockmen. So that's a really useful piece of information for me. Some of the other stuff I found, let's have a look. These are two pieces of rock, but those two pieces of rock don't actually come from around here. They come from an area about half a kilometre, 800 metres away, across a couple of creek beds, and this is a type of basalt. It's very, very hard, and it's been worked by the local people. This one in particular, you can see down the centre, there's been some working, and around the edge there's been also some working to make a sharp blade type structure. So this would have been used for cutting or scraping. And likewise this other one, you can see it's been worked. And so this is the sort of traditional toolkit that Aboriginal people in this area would have used to prepare food, maybe to skin animals and to prepare skins for use for their own day-to-day living. So this stuff is pretty old. I can't date it absolutely, but my guess is it's pre-colonial, or at least pre-exploration, and that takes it back before the 1840s. So I'm pretty pleased with that. Life changed for Badamaya people. The literature indicates that most Aboriginal communities associated with pastoralism came and worked or lived around the pastoral stations within maybe 20 years of the arrival of pastoralism, and their life then became a blend of the old traditional way and what's happening. They're mixing with the pastoralists and using some of their artefacts to change their way of life and adapt. So these two pieces of glass have been worked by Aboriginal people to make a tool which they can use for their lifestyle around the homestead. The first one, this is the neck of a bottle and a bit of a shoulder, and you can see there's been some scalloping. That hasn't happened by accident, that's been napped or shaped by careful chipping, and that would have been used to maybe cut something or else again to scrape. I think that's a really neat piece of material to find. And the other piece of glass, that's probably from, I think, the neck of a vinegar or a salad oil bottle, and you can see just around where my hand is, there's some working there. It's not a whole lot, but it's certainly been worked, and that's a good piece too. That piece shows a little bit more work. You can see the lines there where it's actually been cut by people to make a knife or a blade of some sort. So what those two pieces of information are showing me, the stone and the glass, is that people initially were using stone tools as their day-to-day lifestyle would dictate. but their life went through a transitional phase whereby they're starting to use the European manufactured material for their own needs. And that's what happens with societies that are in transition. The other interesting finds that I've got, I first thought that was a wheel or a cog in a machine when I first saw it, but this is actually the remains of a fob watch or a pocket watch. And we've found across the site probably half a dozen different examples of watches. This is the best example that I've had. These sorts of watches were used from the 1870s through to just before the First World War. They continued after that, but wristwatches took over. What this is doing here, I'm not sure. Possibly the people used the watch to tell the time, to signal when to come in for food or when their day's work was over. Maybe it was discarded and it was used by the local people as some sort of a high status object. We don't know. Across the sites we've found examples of these things. It doesn't look very inspiring, but this is actually part of a reed plate from a harmonica. And so this is telling me that perhaps after a hard day's work the people are sitting around playing music. Harmonicas came to Australia. They've been in Australia since at least the 1820s, so this doesn't give us a whole lot of good dating range or information. It's showing an adaptation of Western or European artefacts to provide entertainment for themselves. In terms of dating, there's a whole lot of different types of bottles, and there's also ceramics and cans, and you can look at the way these things were manufactured, or if you're lucky there might be a maker's mark of some sort, and you can get a date range. So you can see that's got a pressed seal on the top. That gives us some sort of clue. That neck and the bottle it came from were probably made in the 1880s, maybe through to the 1920s. That's a screw top, and the manufacturing history tells us that was probably manufactured sometime in the 1930s, 1940s. So we start to get date ranges from some of the material that we've got here. That's an example of a Holbrook sauce bottle top. It's starting to tell us, and there's lots of those on site. They used a lot of sauces, pickles, condiments. Was that to flavour the food, to add flavour, to maybe disguise the flavour of what was available? We don't know. The canned food is indicative of living out of cans and eating fairly basic stuff. So you can see by looking at what people leave behind, you start to get a very basic picture of how people lived and what they did on site here over the period of time that I'm studying.